Here we go. Here's where we need to be. Project monitoring and reporting. So I'm just going to let you know that project monitoring can be continuous, obviously, on your end, but there are official monitoring visits that your program manager will be doing. And the way those are determined are based on your annual risk assessment. So your risk assessment is customarily completed by your assigned program manager, usually once a year when new projects are approved for funding. They could be updated anytime during the year to reflect the most current information that we may know of at that time. So the risk assessment helps highway safety determine how often we're going to come and see you or monitor your project based on the complexity of your project, like how much money you're managing, the different aspects of your project, contractual employees, things of that nature, and also your past project performance. So if you're wondering why program managers talk a lot about getting your reports in on time and making sure that you're letting us know how your project is progressing through those reports, it's because your past project performance certainly reflects on your risk assessment. So your program manager lets you know how often the monitoring is going to occur for your project. Your program manager will contact you regarding scheduling a time for monitoring your project, and they'll determine what type of monitoring visit is appropriate. So, we have desk audits, as we call them, where there's kind of we're looking at your reports and visiting with you maybe by phone, talking to you through email, but the monitoring visits that most often occur through scheduling is usually going to be a virtual visit, similar to the virtual training we're having now. And then we do site visits, which are actually at the location of your project, usually your PD or your sheriff's department or your office. So during a monitoring visit or a monitoring event, we're going to call it, your program manager is going to discuss your progress, any problems you might be having, and any successes of the project. So through the year, depending on how often they come and see you or how often they conduct these monitoring visits, you'll need to be prepared for these. So your program manager will make recommendations, and they'll also talk to you about upcoming events, dates, and possible deadlines that may be coming. So monitoring at a minimum includes a discussion of current project performance and any project issues with your program manager. In-depth audits of records, project performance, processes, and internal controls may also be conducted at specific times during the year or in response to any identified issues. So you want to be prepared for project monitoring visits, making note of the date and time, and be prepared depending on what type of visit is being conducted. So virtual meetings require technology connections, so you want to make sure you're prepared by maybe testing your connections before the meeting. You want to invite anyone that you feel like would be able to inject information into the meeting, the financial officer or anyone else who should attend. And you want to be sure and let your program manager know who you've invited. It's best to be up to date with your project report submissions. So that way your program manager has had an opportunity to look at your reports and determine if there's anything that needs to be discussed. So you need to be ready with questions, concerns, and certainly you want to be able to brag about your project. Tell us about any exceptional performance or anything going on at the time. Take note of any upcoming events. A lot of times we'll talk to you about some of the things that are up and coming here at the office, any NHTSA specific events like our mobilizations, click it or ticket, drive sober, get pulled over, and a few other things that do occur during the year. And so you want to be prepared and take note of any upcoming events that benefit your project. Take note of any deadlines for your project. So are you behind on your reports? Do you understand when the next report is due? Sometimes we get busy just implementing the project and we kind of lose track of where we are in time. So if you're going to have an in-person meeting, you may also want to be prepared with some things that are, tangible documents that your program manager may want to look at. And that's going to include your project records. You're going to be ready with any equipment that may need to be tagged, highway safety tags equipment that is grant funded. And once it's purchased, we have to apply an actual inventory tag number for that and to indicate that it was purchased with federal funds. And so you want to have any equipment available for tagging that you may have purchased. Now, sometimes this can be a chore. I know there's times when you have already deployed the equipment, perhaps it's in a unit already being utilized, and so you want to know where it is, who has it, what vehicle it's in, and have it available if possible so that the program manager can apply that inventory tag and inspect the equipment. Some of the things that we kind of forget about sometimes is that we need an appropriate meeting area. So you want some place where you can have a discussion with your program manager and maybe not be interrupted. You have room to spread out if there's files that need to be inspected. And while we're talking about inspecting files, the past 3 complete years of project records should be maintained along with the current year. So for anyone that's had a continuous project for the last 3 years, for this October 1st, starting FY 2023, you should have fiscal year 2020, 2021, 2022, and then your current year, which is 2023. That should be available for inspection during this grant year. So if your agency has not had a grant for 3 years prior to FY 23, then there are really no project records available to be maintained other than the current year. So what is contained in the monitoring reports? So this is some information that you'll need to be aware of. So your program manager is going to complete a monitoring report. It's put into the OGX system and it details project progress and key points of discussion. So how do they know what your project progress is, how the progress is going? Well, the only way they know is through your reports that it should be up to date, and certainly whatever you've discussed at your monitoring visit or during your virtual visit. So monitoring of your project certainly includes those reports that come in, so your program manager is fully aware of where you are in the progress of your project. So your monthly reports are very important. So you want to review your monitoring reports once they're completed in the system to make sure there's not an action item that you need to follow up with, or just simply to see what your program manager has indicated the progress of your project is. Maybe there's something that that you discussed that maybe you failed to make note of, or perhaps there's something you want to brag to your superiors about. Look at how our project is, what highway safety has said about our project. So there's a process for your program manager that your program manager follows to monitor your project, and it has checks and balances in place to assist with keeping your project on track. So monitoring reports are submitted and approved through the Highway Safety Administration before you have access to view them. And all reporting in the OGX system is available to our NHTSA Region 6 management representatives. So they have access to be able to look in the OGX system and see any report that you submitted, anything that we have put in there as well. So let's start with a review question. How is the frequency of your project monitoring visits determined? So let's see who all can put that in the chat. Answer that question. How is the frequency? How often are project monitoring visits determined? How does a program manager determine how many times that they come and see you? So what do they use to make that determination? All right, risk assessment. When they get ready, come on. Okay, well, I could see that some of my past projects are just keeping me going here. Okay, you can give me an emoji if you feel like you need to. Okay, you can do that too. Okay, so we all know that it's the risk assessment, right? So it's based on your annual risk assessment. So, so and your program manager will be doing that once your grant has been awarded, usually about once a year, unless something requires an update. So, very good, risk assessment. That's right. Okay, let's talk about your documentation requirements. These are really important for your project files, for keeping track of productivity, keeping track of your financials. There's a lot of things that go along with these projects, and documentation is really, if you can keep good documents, you can always go back and kind of, if you need to research something, you can find what you need. So we want to be sure and stay on top of that. So documentation for your grant includes specific documents that are provided during monthly reporting. So that's those that you upload into the OGX system. It also includes anything that you have attached to your application and anything that is uploaded as an attachment when your agreement is being built, and certainly once it's been approved and authorized in our OGX system, then those documents are all there for inspection. And so those are project files that would be actually part of your reports and part of your agreement, things that you're required to produce, usually as like during your pre-application process, or anything that your program manager has asked you for to verify policies and procedures of your agency. And so with your project files, there's also documents that you upload to your monthly reports. And these would be documents that support your reimbursement request, and certainly documents that support your activities that occur month to month with your project. Documentation that contains personal identifying information should be kept at your agency level and not provided to the Highway Safety Office. So some examples might be citations that have the public's name on them, their birth dates, crash reports, the same identifying information, any arrest reports, credit card numbers. And we know that sometimes receipts have maybe the last 4 digits of a credit card number, but for the most part, we don't want any full information like that that's available in the system. Any personal employee information or personal information about the public or grant participants probably should be kept at the project level. And so these are available for inspection by your program manager, but should not be uploaded to your monthly reports. If any personal information is necessary, your program manager requests it specifically during your project monitoring. So let's talk about documenting your activity. So the Highway Safety Activity Sheet, when it's completed, requires information that details grant-related activities, the time that work begins and ends, the number of hours worked, what agency, what type of activity, and is usually signed by the employee and a supervisor. You may think this kind of sounds like a timesheet. Well, it kind of is, except it also tracks the activity. Now, this particular sheet is used for enforcement activities and enforcement grants, and is the most common type of document that you might be completing. This documents what activities are actually being conducted, and it allows your program manager to review and confirm activities as part of grant-related work. So we're able to actually look at that and verify how many hours you worked, when you made your stops, the different information that's on there. If a citation or a warning was issued, we're able to actually look and see what types of activities are occurring. It allows your program manager to review and confirm that these activities are part of grant-related work. So that's very important. We don't pay for work that is outside of the grant. So, and also these forms usually contain a fraud warning, what they should contain, a fraud warning. It's included on these documents, and it's usually near the bottom where the employee's signature and the supervisor signs. And if you didn't already know, it simply says, I understand that this information is being submitted to support a claim against a federally funded grant program. False statements on this form may be prosecutable under 18 U.S.C. 1001, and the information on this form is true, correct, and complete to the best of my knowledge and ability. This is something that you want to point out. If you're the project director, you want to point this out to anyone that is participating in your grant to make sure they're clearly aware that this is something that's being tracked and that they are affirming that this is a true, correct, and complete information related to their participation. So let's talk about salaried employees. So not just overtime and not just enforcement activities, but we also have salaried employees that participate in our grants. So you're going to want to know that time accountability is the key here. It can be time consuming, but is the most important part of your grant. Automated time reports that you customarily complete for your agency are very different, and they're really documenting your time. The fact that you're conducting hours related to our grant is very important to us. We know that you're not always giving 100% of your attention to the project. You may just have a portion of your time that's being devoted. Some are only funded at 50% or whatever the grant indicates. And so highway safety only pays for the time that is devoted to the project. So it's important to document what activities you're doing, including dates, times, and the descriptions of the activity. So if you're going traveling somewhere to conduct a grant-related activity, you want to document, those hours devoted to that, set up, conducting the event, where you were at, what it was for, those sort of things. So those are all very important things. So some personnel actually keep a diary or a running calendar of day-to-day activities to assist with properly documenting hours devoted to our project. Your hours in activity are auditable to confirm that project-specific activities were the focus of your time. So your supervisor is also required to certify that your time was devoted to the project each quarter, usually on a certification. So the fraud statement is required usually near signature blocks when you're certifying this time. We do have those on our quarterly certification of time. We don't always require it whenever you're doing your month-to-month, just a timesheet showing the hours that you've worked, but you do have to certify that each quarter with the number of hours or how much time was devoted to the project, and the fraud statement is required. Some agencies have also added a statement for the supervisor signature that says, I certify this employee worked the appropriate amount of time conducting project-related activities in accordance with the Highway Safety Grant. So let's talk a little bit about payroll documentation. It can get a little hairy documenting payroll, but it's a process, and you just make sure that you have a check and balance in place to get those done. And usually your financial officer will be a key part of that, because we know that project directors are not familiar with how payroll always works. And so that financial officer is a key person that you want to be discussing documentation with and being able to know what you're looking at. So Payroll reports, again, are very different depending on what agency you work for. But to be acceptable, they must have minimum information like what is mentioned here. So highway safety must know that the amount requested has actually been paid to the employee. So you can't ask for reimbursement of something that has not actually been paid out and put in the pocket of your employee or whoever's conducting grant activities. Someone in the financial department, payroll, or financial officer needs to provide signature verification that the information contained in whatever pay document you have is actually authentic and payroll has been dispersed. So the minimum requirements on that form or on the payroll documentation, we need to know the employee pay rate, any changes in pay rates as they occur, the summary of payments, and there's a list of things here that you need to have there. Now,
we've got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Terry, do you need copies of the pay stub?
The pay stub is something that you may want to keep for your project records. It is not a requirement, provided the document you provide for payroll is accurate, signed off by your finance person, and showing when it was paid. So as long as this basic information, but to back up this basic information you may be providing on a spreadsheet, let's say, I'm sure that's kind of what you're asking. There are several agencies that provide their payroll on a spreadsheet format, but it is verified by the finance officer as being paid out. There's a date of pay. All of these elements that you see here on this slide are included in that document. So just make sure you're meeting that. If there was a question of anything, then the stub would back that up. So let's talk about contractual employees. Now, I know we do have projects that have contractual employees. So contractual personnel provide project services that are detailed in a grant agreement, and they sometimes include professional services. It may include travel expenses and any materials that they require. Some contractors submit an invoice for their costs. Some agencies regularly utilize contract labor for project delivery, and they have developed a form to track necessary information to confirm project services were delivered and contractors were compensated for grant-related work. The fraud statement should be used on any form, and certainly if you have a contractor, what applies to the agency also applies to the contractor. So whatever rules and regulations that your agency has to follow applies to the contractor, and rightfully so, along with our highway safety grant, the same application applies there. Any form or any document, like an invoice, should be signed by the contractor and approved by agency personnel. The travel also has to be documented in like manner to any other travel that is reimbursed within your grant agreement. And we're going to talk a little bit more detail about travel. The important thing here is that the agency personnel, your project, as project director, you have to confirm that services actually occurred. You are confirming that whatever this contractor was hired to do actually delivered these services. So you're either signing off that this event was completed, you're providing, maybe it's a presenter that is coming in for training, you're providing a list of people that attended the training, maybe the roster. These are all things that confirm services were actually conducted and that's why this contractor was compensated. And so, so you want to be sure that you're doing this in like manner to what you would do if this was an employee working for your agency.
Hey, Sam.
Yes.
We have another question.
Okay.
Is a contractor the same as a vendor?
It can be. It can be. You can treat a contractor like a vendor, which is why when I say that sometimes they provide an invoice, yes, the invoice may state, for professional services, It may have teaching materials on there that you're required to reimburse. So it's kind of a detail of what services this vendor provided or this person provided. Every agency is a little bit different, but when we have invoices like that, it's usually something that like a one-time event or some type of training that is conducted periodically, something that is not an ongoing everyday thing. So yes, they would be treated like a vendor. You're right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about documentation for purchases. So your project makes purchases throughout the year, usually under an operating cost line item, but there's also other purchases like equipment that occur. And so proof of purchases should always include who made the purchase, who it was purchased from, the date of purchase, what was purchased, what the costs were, and proof of payment. So an invoice provides most of this information, but receipt of goods is likely something that is not documented clearly by the invoice that you received. You're going to have to write on there, these things were received, when they were received, who received them. I'm pretty sure that most agencies require evidence that the goods were received before they actually pay an invoice or a cost. And so if you're talking to a finance person or in your finance department and something came in that was shipped to your agency, it may come to you, but you have to provide them documents along with the invoice in order to have it properly paid. Well, they don't generally pay for something that hasn't been received. And so you'll have to provide some type of evidence that there's proof of receipt of goods. Well, highway safety requires this too. So don't, be sure that when you're making purchases, someone is signing that this was actually received, when it was received, and so forth. So that way we can clearly see what has occurred and make sure that your agency has actually received the goods before we reimburse. In addition to that, we have to have proof of payment. Some agencies, provide the canceled check. Sometimes it's the check itself. There are different types of payment documents that can be provided, and your finance department is probably familiar with what we need in order to justify the reimbursement request. So if you happen to be in person purchasing something like at Walmart or a package store or something that is a direct sale, you want to be sure that you put something on that receipt indicating what was received. You want to make sure it's very clear, I received this on this date. If a shipment is drop shipped to another location other than your agency, you want to have someone at that location verifying that the goods were actually received. This documentation has to be provided to highway safety so that we know that the products were actually received. Online purchases should be documented when the shipment of goods are actually received, and we understand kind of how that works. So purchases should be done in accordance with your agency inventory and purchasing policies that were provided to highway safety. We just want to be sure that you're in line with what your agency requires. And then when we receive things, if there is a question about anything, that is going to be our default, is to go back to what your agency's purchasing policy is. Grant-funded equipment requires verification of training for those who utilize it. So when you think about purchasing grant equipment, you're also going to want to be sure that once it's received, you want people that are going to be utilizing it properly trained. If it's a brand new radar that is a little bit different, maybe a LiDAR, and they're used to using stationary radar, you want to make sure that everyone that is utilizing that LiDAR has received proper training. And your grant agreement will likely have a location for you to verify that has occurred, maybe in your milestones, or you want to be sure and include that when you're doing your narrative report. So grant-funded equipment, when it's received, and I just want you to know that when we fund grant-funded equipment, we like you to purchase that right away as soon as the grant year begins so that you can receive it and be utilizing it throughout the grant year. We know that sometimes that's not possible because of supply issues that we've recently experienced, but that is our preference. And the idea is for you to be able to use any equipment to enhance your project during the current project year that it was purchased in. So just kind of be aware of that. You don't want to put that off. You want to be able to get that purchased, get it paid for, and then ask for reimbursement from Highway Safety. And that is something that your program manager will ask you about during your monitoring visits, is if you've purchased your equipment or not, or how come you have not yet purchased your equipment. So you want to be able to provide that information to them. The Buy America Act really only applies to things that are over $5,000, and you would have been talking to Highway Safety long before a purchase was approved for grant funding, and so that is something that is required for purchases of equipment over $5,000. All right, let's do a review question. Are citations included with your monthly report submissions in the OGX system? Tell me in the chat. So are we going to upload our citations each month when we submit our reports? Well, why not? Why aren't we doing that? So tell me. I mean, everybody's saying no, no, no. No, I love it. I love it. Thanks. Look at that. I like it. Okay. Negative. That's right. We don't do that, right? Okay. And why don't we do that? Tell me why we don't do that. Personal information. That's right. Because they include personal information about the public. They should be included in project files and maintained at the agency level. Now, they are an auditable document, so you want to be sure that you're able to access these at the request of your program manager anytime that you need to verify information or there's an audit going. So you want to be sure that you're keeping track of that. So very good. That's exciting. All right. This is my absolute favorite discussion to have. Travel. We love to travel, right? So when you're planning your travel, you want to know where you're going, when you're going, and Highway Safety is going to want to know that too. But you also need to be aware that every agency does not have travel, out-of-state travel that is designated specific in their grant agreement. Most of the time we do try to designate specific conferences or specific types of travel, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's travel that is, to an out-of-state conference, and maybe we haven't made the determination of where you're going. So you want to be sure that any travel that is not completely designated in your agreement as where you're going, you want to be sure that you're getting pre-approval from Highway Safety on that travel. So if you find out where you want to go, you have out-of-state travel, there is something that's going on, and it is not detailed in your grant agreement, you want to be sure to touch base with your program manager and get pre-approval for any travel. There's usually a form that we have you complete, and it needs to be part of customary project-related activities. So give your program manager time to process this request. I know there's been times when all of a sudden, poof, there's a request for travel and it's 2 days out from when you're supposed to go. And so we want to avoid that. We want to be able to have time to review that, discuss it if we need to with our administration, and then be sure and get it back to you as approved. So be sure and give your program manager time to review that information. For the best use of grant funds, you should always register for any conference as early as possible. Keep track of all travel expenses, transportation, lodging, meals, registration, noting any events that change your plans, such as what? Flight delays. Sometimes there's cancellations in the middle of things. We know at one point, the travel for Lifesavers was canceled in the middle of things, so because of COVID. And so there's things that affect sometimes our travel plans. I mean, it's better that you make your plans early. It's less expensive for your agency and for your grant, but sometimes those those plans don't go through exactly as we planned them. So you want to keep track of all that. For per diem purposes, you want to note what the day and time that you enter travel status, or you leave your duty station or your home, and the day and time that you return. So per diem applies to trips that are over 60 miles away, that are overnight with lodging as required for official business. So whatever you're doing has to be pre-approved, already in your agreement, or you've already discussed with your program manager, or it is a customary duty of what your project does, like child passenger safety training, staying somewhere because you're doing outreach and administering your program. So there are things, and we're talking about in-state and out-of-state, that allow for that. But you want to make sure you're keeping track of what's going on in the dates and times of your travel. Make sure you know your agency's policy for travel expenses. Any costs paid by the employee must be reimbursed by the agency before you can request reimbursement from Highway Safety. So when you're sending this documentation to us, we have to know that you've already been reimbursed for it. If you personally paid for it yourself, or the employee personally paid for this travel themselves, we have to know the agency, because our agreement is with the agency, not with that person. So we don't pay that person, we pay your agency. So we have to know that that person was reimbursed. So if you're planning travel, you want to know how you're going to get there. Are you driving? Are you flying? Highway safety, because of the use of funds, and we want you to be responsible, use your funds responsibly. Economy tickets are the only way that we reimburse when you're flying. If you decide to update your ticket, then you're going to need to take care of that on your expense and not ask for reimbursement except for the economy cost. We basically just cannot reimburse business or first class. So we have sure that's this. So we have some ideas about per diem that sometimes it becomes really a sticking point whenever we're trying to review your reports and get these prepared for reimbursement. So per diem is something that is tracked from the time you enter travel status. So day and time of travel status till the time you return, day and time of return. But there's rules that apply during that period of time while you're in travel status that affect your per diem reimbursement. So during your travel period, you are reimbursed at a certain rate per day based on the federal GSA method of calculating per diem. And I know that in the past we have had what we call the state travel reimbursement. We still have that, but they have updated the per diem specifically in that effective November 1. So during the 2022 legislative session, it was revised to change the way in which per diem is calculated and reimbursed. The state will be moving to the federal GSA method of calculating per diem, and that does again begin November 1st. Some of the main differences between the state's current per diem calculation method and the new method are the 24-hour rule will no longer apply to the start or end of your travel status. Instead, status cannot begin more than one calendar day before the start of the event. And that's not registration, it's the start of the event. So if we're talking about lifesavers, the plenary session, the first day of the plenary session, unless you are pre-approved for a pre-conference event. So the plenary session, when it begins, if it starts at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, so you can see where 24 hours prior to that is what the 24-hour rule applies to. So per diem reimbursement is no longer based on quarters per day. Moving forward, the first and last day of travel is reimbursed at 3/4 of the daily per diem rate, and each day between the first and last day of travel will be reimbursed at the full daily per diem rate. So guess what? There is a calculator that's available. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's on the GSA website. Meals will no longer be deducted from the per diem total at a quarter of the daily rate per meal. Meals will be deducted based on the amounts actually listed in the GSA website. So there's different amounts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Continental breakfast are now required to be deducted if they're included in the cost of registration. So complimentary breakfasts, like those provided by hotels free of charge, are not deducted from per diem. Thank you, Angela, for putting that in the chat. I appreciate it. So more information will come with this little change. I mean, it's not a dramatic change. We kind of used to go by this in the past. I know, I love emojis. So anyway, that's going to happen with your per diem. So just letting you know that. So we'll go back to the flights. You have to make sure that they're economy. You have to include the dates, times, and what seat you have purchased. So a lot of times you guys send stuff and there's no itinerary. And so you need to provide that itinerary to us. Airport parking is allowable for reimbursement as long as you provide appropriate documentation. And so we also want to talk about odometer readings. So to and from the airport, travel is also reimbursable. The odometer readings need to provide a start and end address, not just home to the airport, which is sometimes what we get. So you want to be sure and tell us where is home and where's the airport, because if we have to audit, we need to see what kind of mileage we're talking about. So you didn't drive 100 miles, it was only 10 miles. So you see where we're going here. Odometer readings are not always accurate. You can transpose numbers. There are things that can occur, but if we clearly have addresses, we can always double check that to make sure it's accurate. All right. Where are you staying at? So that's an important thing too. The conference hotel or approved conference overflow hotel, these are rates that are usually much higher than the federally approved rate. And so these are acceptable for reimbursement based on the conference and certainly everything else you have, the registration and so forth. So proof of the conference rate is required. Most of the time, that's pretty obvious in your registration information, in your agenda. There's things that can tell us what the approved conference rate is. And so you want to be sure that we're well aware of that if it's something that we're not used to seeing. And so, but if you stay at another hotel, we can only reimburse the federally approved rate, not the conference rate. So just kind of keep that in mind. The federally approved rate is based on where you're at, where you're staying, what state, what city. And so that will be on the GSA website. So you want to be sure and verify that you have all that information. So per diem or meals, and every agency has a little different take on this. So some agencies require you to bring back receipts for all of your costs, including your meals. And so that's up to your agency. That's why you have to follow their policy. It is reimbursable. It's still based on the GSA costs. So you can't go over the per diem amount based on when you entered travel status and when you returned. But there are, it's still allowable costs. So you just have to provide the same receipts that you're providing to your agency for reimbursement purposes. So you want to be sure that the meal receipts, any meal receipts you have that doesn't have order details, we really do not like reimbursing this, okay? So you really have to provide us some detail because we do not pay for alcoholic beverages. And we don't get in the business of telling you what to do when you're traveling, but we can't reimburse a cost for any type of alcoholic beverages. We can't reimburse someone else's meal, reimbursing your meal. And so meal receipts should have order details that clearly indicate what was purchased at the time, and it allow us an opportunity to deduct the alcoholic beverage if it is listed on that receipt. And so I do highly recommend that you do that before you submit that to Highway Safety for reimbursement. It helps us, and it keeps, if your agency decides to reimburse that to you, that's your agency. Otherwise, Highway Safety will not reimburse that cost. Travel has to be necessary for project-related activities. So you've got to provide the address from location to location. So you can't go somewhere, rent a vehicle, and then go on a sightseeing tour for a few hours and come back and expect to be reimbursed for anything like that. So even if you're not using a rental vehicle, if you're using your personal vehicle, it has to be for activities related to the project. So so we don't pay for you to go some neat place that happens to be 50 miles away, some neat restaurant that you've been wanting to visit. We don't pay for those miles, and we don't reimburse that as part of your per diem. Personal vehicle use is allowable for reimbursement provided your agency policy allows for that. And so you need to make sure that you're in touch with your agency, making sure you're doing what you need to do with them and documenting appropriately. As of July 1, the mileage rate has changed to 62.5 cents per mile, which is great. Normally it doesn't change but once a year, but it's if you haven't noticed, the gas has risen in expense, and so we all appreciate that the mileage rate has been updated to a higher rate. So right now, 0.625 per mile is what we will reimburse. Now, you always want to know what your agency may be different. They may reimburse at a different rate, particularly for personal vehicle use. So you want to be sure that you're verifying that with your agency before you are submitting for reimbursement. Your duty station is your office or agency. So really, if you're leaving during a work week or your normal times, your normal hours of work, then you'll be leaving from your duty station. The only time we allow you to leave from home really is if maybe it's closer for you. If you're coming in or leaving during a period of time when it's not your normal work hours, then certainly we understand that you would be traveling from your home. Always discuss this with your program manager if your situation is different. I know that there's a lot of people that are working from home nowadays, and so so your duty station obviously would be your home if that's where you office. So so depending on what your agency requires, be sure and talk to your program manager about that if you have any type of situation that you have a question about. Okay, let's talk about travel reimbursement. Meals are per diem. You need your receipt, proof of the per diem rate. So all of this you need to print out and have it available when you submit it. Proof of agency reimbursement to the employee. Mileage is reimbursed. Workday mileage is calculated from your duty station. Off-day travel is calculated from your home. And again, talk to your program manager if you have a different situation. So here are some references to bookmark: the Oklahoma State Travel Reimbursement Act, Oklahoma State Travel Policy, federal reimbursement rates, and the new method for calculating per diem that's effective November 1st. It will default to what the GSA website has. And so the federal reimbursement rates, there is a calculator there to reimburse your per diem and your costs. And I would highly recommend that you utilize that. Make sure that you're organizing your documents when you submit things to Highway Safety. Oh, let's do a review question. Sorry, and I've already given you the answer. Let's go back. Okay, what must be included in documentation necessary for reimbursement of mileage? Okay, so what do you have to document mileage, reimbursement of mileage? This would be to and from the airport, to and from your place, odometer readings, okay, addresses, exactly. We have to have those odometers and the addresses. What else do we have to have? Starting location and destination activity has to, we have to have something that shows us what activity you're doing. Map miles or odometer readings, proof of reimbursement for personal vehicle use if it applies, obviously. Very good.
Hey, Sam.
Yes.
We have a clarification question.
Okay.
Lisa Harper asked, if leaving from home is closer to the location you're traveling to than your duty station, can that mileage be claimed starting from home?
Certainly, that's the best use of funds. If it's closer, it is the best use of funds. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, let's organize our documentation when you're sending it to your program manager, okay? So when you have a reimbursement request, it's real important that the documents that you upload are in a way that maybe correspond to how your report is organized. Perhaps you're sending an invoice or you're sending a spreadsheet that has all your different line items and costs. So you want to try to put it in some sort of order. So even attachments should be in an order, like maybe the employees are listed in alphabetical order on your sheets, maybe chronological order, like in the date order. Make sure you're identifying your attachments accurately. Sometimes we can forget what we've uploaded and not identify it properly. Some agencies even put the documents, upload documents in the order of the expenditure report, the invoice, or even the highway safety budget details. So, maybe the first documents are your salary, so you're putting all of your salary documents in there, anything to report salaries of your employees, and then the next is your benefits, and then maybe your benefits are uploaded, and so on, depending on what the line item, operating costs. So make sure that you're uploading and you're organizing your report in a way that makes it easy for you if you're looking for a mistake or trying to verify everything is there before submitting it, and certainly for highway safety as we're reviewing those documents. I can't express enough how important it is sometimes when you're doing your reports that you don't get in too big of a hurry. Take your time and make sure you have everything there before you submit it to us. So, all right, some of the things that happen: missing signatures, invoices, activity sheets, receipt of goods. We get something in here and there's proof of payment, but there's no evidence that the product was received. You purchase something that's not reimbursable. All of those things you need to be talking to your program manager about, and certainly don't submit those on your reimbursement request. Any documentation that's missing, we get a lot of this when we have purchases. Make sure that you have all your documents there. Again, if you organize your report when you're sending it to us in your attachments, it makes it easier to make sure everything is there. And make sure the pay rate is right. When it's inconsistent, particularly if we have a reduction in an hourly rate, it's a problem. So you want to try to contact your program manager if you have any questions or concerns. Okay, and that concludes all of the documentation part of your project.